This is all about Bitcoin, a show dedicated to all things questions and markets related to Bitcoin, little b for the currency, and Bitcoin, big B for the network, a collective journey to understand, apply, and use this innovation, all Bitcoin, all the time. I'm your host, Christine Lee. Let's have a live look at Bitcoin right now. The CoinDesk Bitcoin price XPX index is at $36,277. Bitcoin is down over 8% over the past 24 hours. The most reliable reference prices for institutions since 2014 are now published under the CoinDesk brand, trusted globally as the leader in crypto news, events, and data. All right, the Luna Foundation Guard acquiring $1.5 billion in Bitcoin to reinforce stablecoin reserves as it continues to move toward its target of having $10 billion of stablecoin reserves before the end of the third quarter. The purchases were made in the form of two over-the-counter deals, one a $1 billion swap of stablecoin UST for Bitcoin with crypto prime broker Genesis Global Trading, a CoinDesk sister company, and the other a $500 million purchase of Bitcoin from hedge fund Three Arrows Capital. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund saying Bitcoin adoption by Central African Republic raises a series of challenges for the country and the region. The decision to make Bitcoin legal tender last week drew criticism from opposition parties and was made without consulting the regional central bank, according to a Bloomberg report. And U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren joining the Labor Department in expressing concerns about Fidelity Investments' plan to offer Bitcoin in its 401k retirement plans. In a joint letter with Senator Tina Smith, Warren asked Fidelity about the appropriateness of its plans, describing investing in crypto as, quote, a risky and speculative gamble.
Fastest growing crypto app.
Just one day after crypto and traditional markets soared on Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell's comment that the U.S. Central Bank wasn't likely to raise interest rates by more than 50 basis points at coming meetings, the dynamics of financial markets quickly changed. Bitcoin plunging over 8%, its lowest level since February, and its biggest one-day decline in 2 months. Bitbull Capital saying yesterday's FOMC meeting saw a rate hike alongside more concrete balance sheet contraction talk, things that don't bode well for markets. Even though there was an initial surge in BTC, it is not isolated from these macroeconomic changes, and today's price action reflects that. Bitcoin's drop came as the S&P 500 drops about 4%, and the NASDAQ Composite Index loses over 5%, reflecting the elevated correlation between the two indexes and Bitcoin. Inflation at its fastest pace in 4 decades remains a nagging concern, and the Fed's approach to tackle the issue is still hawkish at a time when doubts are growing whether the U.S. Central Bank can engineer a proverbial soft landing, that is, cooling the economy just enough to ease inflationary pressures without causing an outright recession. And joining us now to discuss BTC price is Bitwise Asset Management Chief Investment Officer Matt Hougan. Hello there, Matt. Thanks for joining us. So, what is behind this plunge?
Yeah, this plunge is all about the Fed. It has nothing to do with what's going on in the underlying crypto economy. The broad capital markets are reflecting on the fact that Chairman Powell's commentary yesterday was actually quite hawkish. They realize that he's looking at some relatively short-term transitory drivers of inflation and projecting those to continue. And so the Fed is going to, at the current path, drive us into a recession. And I think you're seeing a sell-off in the capital markets for that reason. I don't think it is anything crypto-specific. Crypto is just a risk asset. And so when the market goes risk off, you see these kinds of sell-offs. That's what we're seeing today.
So we're seeing that Bitcoin is reacting very closely to the markets, but often there's that argument that Bitcoin is not supposed to act like the markets, like traditional equities. So where do you see this heading? Do you see a decoupling happening more longer term, or do you see this continue with whatever the market moves?
It's a great question. There's absolutely going to be a decoupling longer term. In fact, even if you look historically, what we're seeing play out today is what's played out in the past, which is during sharp risk-off corrections, crypto trades in line with other risk assets. But over long periods of time, you see the secular drivers of crypto overwhelm. That's why crypto's long-term correlation to stocks remains very low, even though during these high-stress macro moments, it gets higher. Look, eventually we're going to normalize from a macro perspective. Eventually the market is going to accurately saying what the Federal Reserve is going to do in the future. And at that point, the underlying fundamentals of crypto will come back and will drive the market, and I think drive it higher. I actually thought there was an interesting moment yesterday during the brief bullish 2-hour period after the Fed's press conference, where you saw Bitcoin and crypto surge higher and faster than the rest of the market. I actually think crypto is somewhat of a coiled spring. The underlying fundamentals are so very strong. The regulatory progress is so strong. The venture capital investment is so strong. The development activity is so strong. It's just being suppressed by these broader market conditions. Once those normalize, I think we'll see crypto be among the highest bouncers, the fastest movers on the upside. But right now, the Fed is in control. Macro forces are in control, and crypto is suffering as a result.
So in your view, what is the best strategy to navigate this volatility?
Yeah, you should expect this volatility to continue. So that's one message I want to be clear from. We aren't past the point where the market has fully intuited what the Fed is going to do, and there's still big macro risks on the horizon. But I do think this is an interesting opportunity for long-term investors. Crypto has actually held up reasonably well, considering the shock to the macro system. And I think things like what we saw yesterday, where it bounced very far, very fast, shows what's going to happen once those macro conditions normalize. So expect there to be another month, another 2 months, another period of volatility. But the long-term outcome on the other side of that, I see as very positive. And I think we've seen multiple indicators that point us in that direction. So for long-term investors, a good time to buy. For short-term investors, expect more volatility.
So you mentioned that there's going to be a decoupling between Bitcoin and the markets in the future. But because there has been so much VC investment, because there has been so much investment by institutions, do you think because of that market now invested in Bitcoin that it will move more like tech and risk assets?
I actually don't. I don't, and for this reason, the fundamental drivers of crypto are just different than the fundamental drivers of traditional stocks. Stocks are driven by earnings, by tax policy, by global economic growth. Crypto at this point in its development is still driven by regulatory progress, by entrepreneurs developing new ideas and applications, by education, by trends that just move to a different drummer than what drives the stock market. So while it is true that more institutional capital is coming in, while I expect that will reduce the volatility of crypto in the future to some degree, it's still the case that the fundamental drivers of crypto are simply different than the fundamental drivers of stocks. And as an investor, you're trying to build a portfolio of assets that are driven by different factors so that over the long term, they zig and zag at different times. That's still true for crypto. I think that's going to be true for at least another 5 years until it's truly mainstream. We're still a long way from that point.
All right. And we got to wrap it there, Matt. But just one last question before we do. What is your price prediction next 6 to end of the year for Bitcoin? 6 months to the end of the year.
A great question. I'm very bullish for the end of the year. I think we'll move, back towards the highs that we saw earlier this year and the late part of last year. Bitcoin, in a sense, is developed for this moment in the market. What we're seeing is the Fed losing control of the economy. We're seeing the Fed trying to weigh inflation against recession. It puts them in a real bind. Bitcoin is made for that moment. It's an alternative monetary system. And I think once we get past this short-term volatility, it's going to be a very strong market for crypto in the second half of the year.
All right. Bullish by Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. That was Bitwise Chief Investment Officer, Matt Hougan. All right, coming up, we've got Jeremy Rubin, who has proposed Bitcoin investment proposal 119, and it's stirring a lot of controversy. That's next.
The CoinDesk Spotlight is brought to you by Nexo, the place to earn on Bitcoin, Ethereum, and more.
Welcome back. A new Bitcoin improvement proposal, BIP119, is causing controversy in the Bitcoin community. It proposes to place conditions on Bitcoin transactions, and it has a lot of pros and cons. For one, developer Jeremy Rubin, who has proposed the soft fork, says it will help with decentralization, scaling, self-custody, and privacy. But other prominent Bitcoin advocates like Andreas Antonopoulos say it could have the unintended consequences of limiting Bitcoin's fungibility and effectively killing Bitcoin. Others raise concerns with the speed by which the proposal requested activation by consensus. Blockstream CEO Adam Back saying concretely proposing to activate anything on Bitcoin without technical and ecosystem consensus is de facto an attack on Bitcoin's change process that protects immutability and security. The anti-fragility is people who defend those principles. All right, joining us now to discuss is Jeremy Rubin, the founder of Bitcoin researcher Judica and the developer behind BIP119. Hi, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us. So you created BIP119, and you're the best person to describe what's it all about. What's the pitch here?
So fundamentally, the pitch is adding a little bit more ability to do smart contracts in Bitcoin and checking out some of the really fantastic use cases that would enable in terms of self-custody, scalability, privacy, and decentralization. This is something that's been kicking around the research community for some time, but people were very concerned about the extent to what might be capable. BIP119 is a very limited form of that is relatively technically uncontroversial. And we can talk about what that means.
All right. So smart contract features like Ethereum tell me a bit, how controversial is that even to discuss in the community?
So we're not really trying to go for like Ethereum. We're trying to go for things that help Bitcoin users do what they're already trying to do today, but do it more successfully. So an example that I like to give of this is vaults, where you could add a little bit better wallet security for users by having a smart contract that limits you when you go to spend, that you set up for yourself. That gives you time to be able to prevent a hacker from stealing your money. That's something that I think is in line with Bitcoin's principles and is not sort of the DeFi, degen, NFT angle that people are really riled up about in Ethereum.
Yeah, and I suppose the controversy lies in what Andreas Antonopoulos said, is that it could kill Bitcoin and there could be these unintended consequences of governments being able to come in and put restrictions into Bitcoin. So is that the case?
That's a little bit of a preposterous case that he's making. It is the case if you added those things to Bitcoin, maybe explicitly, you'd have that risk. But check template verify BIP119 was actually designed to route around all of those possibilities. And the reality is that if you were trying to implement those things, even with BIP119 available, you would do it in a very different way using some of the existing features of Bitcoin. The way that Bitcoin resists those types of attacks on Bitcoin's self-sovereignty is at the social layer, not necessarily at the technical layer.
Okay. Another point of contention was the speed with which this activation request is happening. And so I wonder, what were your thoughts on that? I mean, decentralized consensus is tough enough, so this is kind of an added layer.
Yeah, so I think people have really misinterpreted what I put out. What I did say was that I had prepared a client, and the metaphor I like to use is it's a little bit like a game of tennis. And I was really getting to the ball, and I offered the community the ability to decide to swing or not swing on if this feature should activate. And I actually implemented both the code to activate and block the activation of this new feature so the community could really decide if this was the right thing for Bitcoin. Where it's been misinterpreted is people reading it as I was trying to explicitly force this feature to be turned on, which was not my intent, nor what my actions pointed as.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that your proposal would have gotten less criticism if you were more of an insider, like Peter Wheeler or another Bitcoin developer?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that some of these developers have a really tremendous platform and track record, and that speaks volumes to why they may, seem to have had an easier time at advocating for their changes. The reality is that I've been a Bitcoin developer, at least since 2016, and been involved in the community since 2013 or so. So I'm not quite an outsider to Bitcoin. And I think a lot of it is that in the technical community, people actually are a little bit more on the side of wanting to add features that would rival Ethereum more directly. And they're trying to figure out how to do that safely. And so that's a little bit of the tension that I think people don't necessarily see, is that BIP119 is a very conservative proposal, and developers are trying to figure out how they could do something a little bit more aggressively.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense of how much support in the community you have for this proposal?
So for the proposal itself, I think that there is a considerable amount of support. At least among the technical audience, people understand what it does, understand the properties of why it might be safe. Where there is question among some of the other developers is if it's useful enough. And that's sort of where it points to maybe adding more functionality. But I do have a website, utxos.org/signals, which has like more than 100 different people and organizations in the Bitcoin community who have all indicated interest in having the check template verify functionality available because they have things that they would like to build using it. And so at least from my perspective, there is sufficient demand for it to be useful for Bitcoin to have this.
Interesting. So I'm just curious, how often do we see BIPs being created, and what's next?
Yeah, so a BIP is really something that anybody can make and get a number assigned for. It's no endorsement of any sort of quality or anything. People make BIPs for things that are pretty inadvisable all the time. It's just a way of tracking the progress of it. But in terms of consensus upgrades, we don't see them all too often just because they're a lot more difficult to do. But people kick around ideas for years, and then at a certain point, they propose that they should be included. And that's what we've seen historically across a number of the upgrades that have been included as consensus upgrades to Bitcoin.
Mm-hmm. And so I guess what's next for your proposal? Like when is the deadline, if you will?
So I didn't put out any deadline. I just put a proposal out of saying, if people would like to have this functionality available later this year, here are the actions that they could take to see that happen. The feedback that I've received somewhat broadly is that might be premature. And what I'm trying to do is help people establish a little bit more of a timeline around how we might weigh and evaluate alternatives or pathways for delivering this functionality, evaluations that people might want to do of this technology, and hoping to be able to put that on track for next year or for other proposals that might be delivering more of the functionality that people are looking for.
And just lastly, Jeremy, maybe you can just comment on how the decentralized nature of Bitcoin makes decision-making often very difficult. And what do you think of the slow slog?
So what I really like to remind people is this is the work. We are trying to build sort of the first ever decentralized system of this nature. And there are a lot of things that we don't have perfect answers to. Development process around how Bitcoin improvement proposals to consensus proceed is something that I think is relatively undefined or difficult to define. And some people view that difficulty in defining it as a feature, not a bug, because they think it makes it harder to corrupt. My personal feeling is that if these undefined processes sort of rule the day, that actually leads to more corruption and lower quality results. So overall, what I kind of remind people is that Bitcoin developers might be disagreeing about how we get there, but we all agree about where we're trying to go. And we're kind of like a big dysfunctional family. We're still family at the end of the day.
A dysfunctional family. All right, Jeremy, appreciate you coming on the show and explaining BIP119. Very much wish you good luck on the proposal.
Thank you very much.
Right.
Yep. Take care.
All right. That was Bitcoin developer and Jitka founder Jeremy Rubin. Let's have another quick price check on Bitcoin right now because it's really down there in the red. We see it's down $35,851, down almost 10% over the past 24 hours. So we'll continue to figure out what's going on tomorrow morning. That's it for All About Bitcoin. I'm your host, Christine Lee. We'll do it all over again at 3 o'clock in New York tomorrow. Also join us tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. for First Mover. You're watching CoinDesk TV.